welcome to the Fairy Whispering podcast with me, Claire Casely, and my guest this evening is Dr. Naomi Howell, who's a senior lecturer in medieval studies at the Department of English and Creative Writing at the University of Exeter. Welcome, Naomi.
Thank you, Claire. It's lovely to be here.
Yeah,
Um,
thanks for coming on. And
yeah.
shall we just say a bit about how we met?
Yes, that would be
Yeah,
lovely. So
yeah,
shall I do?
yeah,
We met
carry
in
on.
a wonderful art class of Sarah John's, and she's well, it was really quite magical. It was taking our ideas and being very creative and expressive with them, and actually going from sketches and just vague ideas to actually a small exhibition of our work, and it was really a lovely atmosphere. And I also, by the way, also found that, and I don't know if you found this too, but
Mhm.
um, that my other work was actually really um, yeah, inspired by just sort of letting go of you know, the time pressures and the
Yeah.
goal orientedness that can dominate our lives.
Yeah. And you posed for me, didn't you, for the
Yes,
artwork
I
I
did.
did?
Oh, oh,
Yeah.
that was so lovely. Yes, I remember. I don't know if you want to tell them a little of the stories
Yeah.
that I was doing, but
Mm.
yeah, it was lovely to feel like I could sort of inhabit those stories a tiny bit. But yeah,
Yeah. So Naomi posed for me. She was a character in a folklore story about pixies that I was illustrating as part of the artwork that we were doing. And I might just put those up actually. I'll edit those pictures in. So yeah, I talked Naomi through the story, and then she did different poses to represent the character. It was really fun.
yeah, it was fun, and I liked the multi-sensory-ness of the stories, and
Yeah.
also the fact that you're drawing it, but also like it was. I mean, there was sort of a searching right going on, and
Yes.
also um the kissing of the leaf, which was so
Yes.
it was sort of, it wasn't just visual or a sort of linear story. It was also multi-sensory in a lot of
Y- Yeah, I love that. And that's what I love about this podcast and every the guests that I have on,
yeah,
talking about their different experiences and approaches.
yeah.
And you're going to be sharing something about medieval fairies and medieval
Yeah.
fairy stories this evening, aren't you, with
Yes.
us?
Yes, that's right.
Um, and I was just wondering where your interest in medieval studies started, Naomi, and just talk
Well,
about a bit about your background, where you come from, and uh,
yes, I'm a dual national, Austrian citizen, and a US citizen. My mom's Austrian, and she grew up telling me German fairy tales, or I grew up with her telling me German fairy tales, and those were actually the first children's books I started to read. And I always loved them. In fact, yeah, I was liked to sort of, it actually didn't delight her because I always wanted to dress up in sort of um yeah, sort of princess robes or sort of fantastical, sort of expressive, flowing things. But also my best friend when I was 4, and we're still friends. She's actually a professor at Berkeley. Um, but yeah, we love to play. We played really, really imaginative games. So, like in the garden, we would just pretend ourselves into sort of a fairy landscape, and we you know we went to see Midsummer Night's Dream, and we acted certain parts out, and we love the flower fairy books as well, and
mm,
sort of decide who are we more like, which one, and and so yeah, so it was always something I enjoyed. I didn't know from an early age that I would become a medievalist, but I ended up um, being drawn to it for many different reasons. Uh, but but yeah, what I ended up coming to and focusing on to a large extent is medieval romance, and that is, sort of relevant in a lot of ways. The stories that I was thinking would be fun to share, though it's hard to select because there's so many, um,
Mm.
are medieval romances. And some of the ones that are written down have, you know, come in beautiful manuscripts. I could send you some pictures later on
I'd love that.
from
Yes.
them. Yeah. Uh, and but actually, the interesting thing about romance is that it is a bottom up tradition. So it is, um, was originally called romance because it was in the vernacular. It wasn't Latin, but it was in originally sort of considered a French romance language. But it came quickly to refer in English too to something that the common people spoke.
Hmm.
um, Marie de France is one of the few named medieval authors. She's an amazing poet, and she um, she realized this is after the Norman conquest, and she said to the elite French, the princes and so on, that she's hearing stories sort of told by women, by commoners, and we're missing out, right? So she's
Mm.
translating these stories into French, and then like I'll teach them to my students in English translations. So we start to have um, French writers writing down what had a long tradition in Cornwall and Wales and Brittany, and also throughout Britain. So there's something very much about you know uh, shared experience and interest in otherness that comes
Hmm.
through in romance. That is quite appropriate that a lot of um, the fairies that we get mentioned in the Middle Ages appear in romance. So so yeah, so and there's something about something mysterious. So something powerful, something
Mm.
mysterious. Um, it can be good. Of course, the Flower Fairies books were beautiful and lovely, but also very safe. And
Yeah.
the fairies in medieval romance are they they can be a bit scary and
Mm.
definitely powerful. And yeah, you want to be on their good side, definitely.
Yeah, I that intrigues me, that
Yeah,
type of fairy,
yeah,
that is the true nature of fairies, isn't it? That they have this tricky side to them.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
So yeah. So what kind of fairies appear in medieval
yeah.
tales?
Well, um, so I basically, I guess a little caution is that I, I probably won't be naming all of the kinds. I'll just tell you the ones that sort of sprang to mind. So for example, there are shapeshift. So there are shapeshifters. Um, there are figures. So some of these aren't named as fairies. It's been argued that the Green Knight, for example, who challenges Gawain in King Arthur's court, is like a fairy because he inhabits a mound, and there were Celtic beliefs that circulated that we have records of where fairies inhabit those places. He's also, associated. Well, he's green, so there's a sort of and he hunts in the woods, which is detailed, described. So there's a nature association potentially, um, but he's not named as a fairy. He's definitely uncanny. He's definitely dangerous, and so there are things like that. in one of the ones I love is this lonely young woman who's been married off by her family to this cruel um, old rich man who keeps her in a prison. She longs for someone to love her, and she sort of makes this wish, sort of almost not expecting it to come true. And in flies a hawk knight, and he is incredibly handsome. And he says, actually, I've been in love with you forever. I just had to wait for you to make that exactly that wish so I could appear to you. And
Mm.
so there's, and sort of, is that a fairy? I, it's not named as such, but I think we could um, connect it with certainly fairy realms. When
Yeah.
he is mortally injured by her husband, um, he well, he flies away. He flies back to his land, and she jumps out her tower window and follows the his flecks of blood, and she follows it through a hollow hill, which is quite like a barrow, perhaps.
Mm. Mm.
Um, and when she makes it to his kingdom, um, everyone's asleep. It seems like a strange Sleeping Beauty scenario.
Mhm.
Um, and so yeah, so then he gives her a ring, which I think, yeah, she wears it, but makes her husband forget that anything bad happened, and
Mm.
not suspect that the child she's carrying is actually the fairy king's, right?
Ah,
And
wow.
handy, yeah, handy. And he also
Mm.
gives her a sword to keep safe for for their son, for their child, and at the appropriate time. And I think he even says, "You're going to come see my tomb. You're going to come back here, and at that moment, reveal my son's true identity and give him my
Mm.
sword." And that comes to pass 20 years or several decades later. But that fairy kingdom, which was so strange and mysterious and uncanny, and apparently only accessible by him in flight and by her
Mm.
through the hollow hill, it turns out to be Caerleon. She's in Kerwent, and she goes to Caerleon, and
Ah.
when they go there, it seems like a sort of a regular city, like it's described with
Mm.
streets and people moving around and so on. But they are
Mm.
shown the tomb, and she does tell her son, "Here's your sword, avenge your father," and he kills his cruel stepfather, and yeah. So, that is that story, and he isn't
Yeah.
explicitly called a fairy, but he
Mm.
certainly seems to. The story has connections with those stories, right? Because of yeah,
Yeah.
because of the secrecy, because of him appearing, he's able to appear only to her.
Mm.
Oh, and then there's
Yeah.
one. Yeah. So anyway,
Yeah.
there's one.
It's that's similar to other stories, isn't it, where women are stolen away by
Ah,
a ferryman.
I've
Um,
got one like that.
yeah, and fairies are can transform into animals as well.
Yes.
So yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
it sounds very much like a fairy person, even if it's not
Right. But
explicitly
and
identified. Yeah,
it may just not have been mentioned because you understand that it's a
yeah,
fair. I mean, it's
sure.
not. Yeah. But
Mm.
he actually at one point he impersonates her. He takes on her form for various reasons. So yeah.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
So like the doppelganger kind of idea
Well,
where he's mimicking her. That's
he
really
it's a
fascinating.
mutual agreement because she's delighted when he appears, but she's a little hesitant because what if he's a force of evil, right? What if he's not?
Mm.
Well, it's easy to say, "I love
Mm-hmm.
you and I'm the perfect man for you," but they've only just met, right?
Mm-hmm.
And he could be someone who wields all that shape-shifting power, but actually be an agent of darkness, right?
Yeah.
And so they agree that she will pretend she's dying and needs to have Holy Communion given to her.
Oh
And
wow.
and
Mm-hmm.
I know, but it's all a deception. And he
Mm-hmm.
will take on her form, and he won't be able to take communion if he is an agent of darkness in the logic of the story. And so that's what he does, and she hides, and he's there in her form, and she watches him get communion, and she's like, fantastic, now we can have a
Oh,
passionate affair out of wedlock. It doesn't matter.
I wonder if Shakespeare was inspired by that story with Romeo and Juliet. It's a
Oh,
similar sort
well,
of.
I mean, Shakespeare would have heard, and we know, well, we know so many. He's got lots of
Mm,
fairies in Romeo and Juliet. We've got Queen Mab. We've got all kinds of references.
mm,
And he definitely, I mean, this is the early modern period. It's a little later than my specialism, but absolutely,
mm,
he was raised with medieval performances and plays and things
mm,
and stories. And a lot of these stories, medieval stories, were still popular into the early modern era,
yeah,
immensely popular,
yeah.
and told with variation and inflection. Yeah, there's a
Mm,
werewolf story where one of the translations is adds this bit, that, and this book is in in the early version, yeah, it's a good werewolf actually, and well, it's kind of a good werewolf. Um, he's a little vile. Yeah, he's pretty horrible too. But anyway, um, but there's no concern with it being real or not. But a
mm,
translator says, and this is real because actually I I saw, or I had a friend who, or no,
mm,
my father saw, someone
mm.
transform into a wolf. So this is yeah, that's a Swedish
Wow.
bird. Yeah, yeah. So
Gosh, so that's an actual account you're talking about of
yes, he's
someone
inserted. So the translator has inserted it into a translation of another
who's.
story, and and
Wow, that's fascinating.
and that's what I
Yeah.
actually
Mm,
love about, well, um, reading, and because we are asked and invited, especially when there's unexplained parts and mysterious parts, we are asked to bring our own experiences to bear, you
mm,
know. So when she's walking through the hollow hill, we don't see all the details because it's dark, right? So we're really
mm.
with her, and yeah, and well, there's a rather bad fairy I can tell you about in a minute, where
Oh, brilliant.
we're also unsure
Mm.
about sort of cause and effect and so.
Because the other interesting element of that story that seems to have been erased during Victorian times,
Yeah,
Victorian censorship and all of that,
yeah,
is the transformation of sex, isn't it? Of a man
absolutely.
into a
Good.
woman.
Well spotted. And
Yeah.
the thing is too, Claire, this
Mm,
is why I love being a medievalist and why I think
yeah.
it's actually really important and relevant, is
Hmm.
because the Victorians were sort of the first medievalists as a sort of discipline, right?
Hmm.
Um, and so they selected out which stories we should look at and how we should look at them, right? So
Hmm.
yeah, these gender transformations, don't worry about that. That's not that made them uneasy. So it's not one of the famous ones, right? It's not one that was
Hmm.
retold and retold. So there's as more medievalists are now women or people of color or
Hmm.
people of various sort of what's the word, sort of not just neurotypical people, but people with
Yeah.
different perspectives and
Hmm.
abilities, right?
Hmm.
We
Hmm.
start to see, oh, we there's actually representation back
Yeah.
then. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's not just stories told by elite white men, such as those that told us
Mm.
which stories to look at and how
Yeah.
to think about them, right? Yeah. So you really have access to voice of people whose names are forgotten, but whose emotions and experiences are transmitted. Yeah.
So it sounds, from my limited knowledge of this subject, it sounds like it was a lot more raw, kind of
A
more
lot more, sorry.
sort of raw and real,
Ah,
and
yeah. They,
it sounds like, tell me if I'm right or wrong
yeah, yeah,
here,
yeah, yeah.
that women were possibly represented more fully in these stories, or
Well, that can vary. That
mm,
can vary widely. So,
mm,
so you can have, I mean, that in written tradition, as in oral tradition, you have different. I mean, I listen to some of your wonderful podcasts, and so you have different people's experiences, right? And just
yeah,
as I mentioned, someone is going to develop, translate, or simply sort of copy, but it's in quotes. They're going to retell this story according to their emphasis, their experience, and their audience, perhaps, right?
mhm,
And so I mean, actually, the the one it's called Sir Orfeo is the one that with the dark fairy force. Oh, glitch. Sorry,
there's
Claire.
thunder. There's
Oh,
lightning and thunder
oh wow!
going
And
on.
just when I mentioned the dark fairy force,
Yeah, crack of thunder and the screen.
glitching,
Yeah,
glitching. Oh, it's okay. We mean you no harm.
it was so strange.
It's like no uncanny, isn't it? Really. So
That's funny.
interesting. Well, should we should we
Yeah.
should we carry on or should we step back?
So you're going to talk about the dark
Yeah,
side.
yeah. Well, I'll start by I'll start by saying this one's interesting because the the composer or composers because of this romance, there's references to how it would have been performed. There's mentions that it would have been sung, and the king himself, Orfeo, who is, um, well, I'll tell you about him in a second. But it takes place. Well, he's in Winchester, so he's in England, and but his name and the name of his wife are taken from Ovid, actually, the Latin um, writer, and from his Metamorphoses. And
Mm-hmm.
so it is taking the story of Orpheus, who descends into the underworld when his wife dies.
Gosh, there was just another crack of thunder then in
Wow!
the underworld.
Yeah, I'm not going to say anything bad about the underworld. I'm not going to
Okay.
disrespect anyone.
No,
So just to say,
respect. Yeah.
yeah.
Okay.
um,
Okay.
well, dark
Mm-hmm.
and dangerous, but not negative, right? Is part of
Mm-hmm.
part of the human experience, I suppose.
Mm-hmm.
So where in the Latin, the version, or actually it's Greek as well, so there are many versions of that story, but he's not a king in the original, or in that version. He's not a king, he's a musician, gifted musician. um and he loves his wife. They're married briefly, and she's bitten by a snake and dies. And he makes his way into the underworld, and says, "Look, he's ready. He knows no one returns from there, and he's ready. He's ready to stay. Um, but if they will take mercy and give her back to him, this is what he asks. But he sings this request. He performs it, and at that moment, all the different people who are inhabiting the dark, Hades and Persephone, but also the Furies, the dark beings of vengeance and justice, um, and the people being punished, Sisyphus rolling his stone up the hill. Everything pauses and listens, and even the most cruel monsters, Cerberus, feels with him because of this story, this song,
Mhm.
and weeps, and he's granted permission to take her back to the land of the living, but he's not allowed to turn around and see her. It's very cruel, poignant, sort of uh, you know, rule, because
Mm.
he only breaks it because he is so desperate to see her,
Yeah.
and they're separated. Now, this Orfeo, this he's it's called a Sir Orfeo, so that gives him a sort of knightly status. He's also a king, because I think this poet or this version is interested in kinds of power,
Mhm.
and what it means and what it should mean. He's also a musician, but it's very different. It's very, very different.
Mm.
Um, and this is one which I used to rather irritate me, because it's actually an exception. You're right. Most, I mean, a lot of romance has very important women. They have important relationships with one another, disputes. Um, they play all different kinds of roles. This one, she's almost, I mean, you could almost call her insignificant, but not quite. Not insignificant. She doesn't get much, she's not allowed to speak much, right?
Mm.
Um, so so it starts off, and he's this wonderful king, and everything's fine, and he's married to this beautiful queen, and she, but almost immediately goes wrong, because she has slept under an orchard tree. And this is a lovely
Mhm.
thing. It's presumably nice weather. She's had a nap. Um, and it's specifically an imp tree.
Oh.
And yes, that is connected with the word imp.
Mhm.
And what it
Oh.
what it what it also means is a grafted tree. So a tree that's got part of one tree and part of another, right?
I see.
As you
Yeah.
would do in
Mm.
orchard. That means
Yeah.
it's a hybrid. It's maybe not entirely one thing, not entirely another, but also maybe, I mean, look, this, we have no
Mm.
explanation for why that is important, but it is very specific that it is under an imp tree. Um, the other
It's
thing is that it's in
interesting.
an orchard, which is again like grafted trees. It is human interaction, but it is natural. So it is also that
Mhm.
liminal space, right? Between,
Mm.
is it human? Is it natural? Is it neither? Is it
Mm.
both? And so she falls asleep there, and she wakes up screaming. She's absolutely desperate. She's almost incomprehensible. She's tearing her hair. She's tearing the her skin on her face. And her husband says, and I think this doesn't make him my favorite, because he says, you used to be so beautiful, and now you're tearing at you're tearing at yourself. You're a wreck. He says, you used to be so soft spoken and still, and you're sort of screaming like a, he doesn't say like a banshee, I should say, but he
Yeah.
does say, now you're screaming, and sort of uncontrollably. You used to be sort of so quiet and contained and under control, is how I'm
Mm.
paraphrasing it, right?
Mhm.
And now sort of all those lovely feminine qualities I liked you for seem to be, you're not doing it. And she finally says that a fairy king appeared to her. Now she slept in this orchard, perhaps surrounded by ladies, by her ladies in waiting. Nobody else seems to have seen anything, and he's going to take her away. And even though Orpheus summons night like 100 knights around, somehow she goes there again at, I guess, the appointed time, and she is abducted, and there's nothing they can do. So,
Wow.
question, right?
Yeah.
I mean, at this point, we haven't seen the fairy king or any
Mm.
fairy. At this point, she could have lost her mind. In fact, people wonder, maybe has she lost her mind? Except that she is definitely gone, right?
Mhm.
And so then Orfeo puts his steward in charge of the kingdom, and he's he puts on sort of rough maybe a pilgrim's garb or penitential garb um or yeah, basically very rough, like a poor person. And so he's basically divested himself of all his lands. There's this description of him going through what once was his land. And
Mm.
the words that are used to describe the natural world shift from being something that was um, his own domain to being wilderness. So there's a shift in
Yeah.
quality before there's even a shift in place.
Mm.
And he wanders around. He puts his harp in a hollow oak tree. He wanders around, and this is the other interesting thing that often happens with fairy and uncanny and revelatory moments in romance is that they can't get there by looking by they don't get directions from anyone. This happens in Gawain and the Green Knight. The only way they find it is by like almost they give up and they get lost. And then it's chance. There has to be some element where it's beyond their control, and that's what will take them to this fairy place.
Mm.
So that is what happens, and it's years later. And yeah, it describes him. He's a mess. He's got a beard. He's dirty. He's yeah. But he at one point, again, having gotten lost and just happened to this place, he sees this very sort of court walking through nature, these beautiful women, and I mean everything. What's interesting is that this is described in much more idealized terms than his own court was to us, right?
I
So
see.
it seems like beautiful, seems like everything but better, you know.
Mm.
Um, this is and that's not uncommon in in fairy stories. You know, like you have King Arthur's court, but then they, you know, will go to this other place and it's kind of even better, right? It's it's not it's maybe not quite okay, but it's in some ways even better.
Yeah.
Um, so anyway, he collects his harp, presumably. Yeah, he does. And he basically does the same sort of getting lost to get there again. Um, now there is a description of how he approaches the fairy kingdom, the fairy castle.
Mm.
And this is a very strange moment because aside from this moment where he is actually moving into their domain, he's describing the walls of the fairy kingdom. And on the walls, in the walls, within the walls, it could almost be describing depicted, but it also seems to be describing actual people. You
Mhm.
see people with their heads cut off, people with stab wounds. It's horrors, horrors, horrors. People who've been poisoned and hung, people who, um, so in that sense, it is imagining or it is taking from the Latin, the idea of the land of the dead, right?
Right. Yeah.
But in, but in, but in this one, they seem to be dead, and in some cases, it almost sounds like they think they're dead. Um,
Mm.
it's
Mhm.
there's a sense that what he's seeing uh is more truth than he had access to before, but not all. We don't we'll never it never gets explained. It is
Mhm.
very scary though. It is very uncanny. It goes into a lot more detail. Um, but in any case, oh, there he sees. And again, this is what makes me it almost seem like it's a depiction, or is it like a hologram, or is it a frozen set of moments in time? But he sees his beautiful beloved wife under the imp tree. He sees her there.
Mhm.
Okay.
Okay.
So then he makes his way in and he manages to get the fairy king to make a what's called a rash boon, right?
Mhm.
Make a make a deal where he tempts them with his musical skill and then resists playing unless he's promised something. And he says, and the king says, fine, I'll give you, sure, I'll give you whatever you ask for, right? And so he plays, everyone's charmed. He asks for his wife, and he gets her back.
Oh,
And
wow.
yes.
Yeah.
So this one has a happy ending. There's a there's a whole separate then part of the story where so they go back. He takes her and now he pretends to be dead. He tells his steward, oh, he's because he's changed so much. He says, oh, I have bad news. Your beloved king has died. It's a test to see, but it's interesting. This sort of pretending to be dead, seeming to be dead, appearance and reality, but also an access to sort of profound powers and
Mm,
forces. Yeah, the steward passes the test, and yeah, that's that's
yeah.
the
That's interesting, that element of sorry, that element of pretending to be dead or having the appearance of death.
yes,
That pops up in
does it?
some fairy stories, yeah, fairy folklore, where a lover will discover, go into the fairy world
Yeah,
and see their dead um,
really?
fiance or
Yes,
in the fairy world, and they'll
really?
say to them, well, that wasn't me. That wasn't me that was buried in the churchyard. That was a
Wow,
stock. So the fairies
wow.
created a fake version, copy
Oh,
of the person, and that was what was buried. But the
oh my
real,
gosh,
yeah.
that's fascinating. That's
Mm,
actually really interesting because I have another story I wasn't really going to talk about it where because it's not explicit, it's not fairy, but the parents of a young man who want to separate him from the young woman he loves. Um, the father wants to kill her. The mother says, let's do something else." So they sell her into slavery. But in order to comfort their son, they make a false tomb. The interesting connection is that, like, I was noticing that some a very fascinating story to me because it is on inter it is the marriage between a Christian and a Muslim, and
mhm,
it has a happy ending. They become the grandparents of Charlemagne, um, but it's he and his sort of it's told from a Christian perspective. It probably originates in all different kinds of religions and cultures.
mhm,
This story and his past, but this version is a Christian perspective. So his he's a Muslim prince, and so that's the other, and it's his parents who, in some versions, actually put a sheep in her tomb, but they make this fake tomb and actually have automata that have that
mm,
are as if alive, and they're so skillfully done that they can even speak. They're fitted with tubes. It's spooky, and
that is creepy,
her
yeah.
statue says to him, to his statue,
Mm.
"I love you more than any living thing."
Ooh.
Yeah, yeah,
That gives me the chills. I mean,
yeah.
it's just like, these are just brilliant. I can see where a lot of the ideas of modern horror
Oh yes,
writers,
oh yes.
have taken a lot of these kind of
Yes,
ideas, haven't they? Mm,
definitely, definitely. Yeah, yeah.
yeah. Thanks for sharing those, Naomi. Was there anything else you wanted to share?
Well, as I say, I
Stories
could
or
I could go on and
I
on.
know it's too much.
There's a wonderful one. I'll just say the name. It's L'Enval. This is a King Arthur's knight who is not having a good time at King Arthur's court, but he is rescued. It's a long story, but he is
Mm.
rescued by a fairy queen who, yes,
Oh wow. Could you give me or
I certainly will.
afterwards, give me the links and names to all of these stories, because then I can put
Definitely.
them in the links for this for this episode.
Absolutely, I will. I'll
Yeah,
be delighted.
yeah. And what do you feel, and there's no right or wrong answers to this,
Mhm.
but a question that appears in the fairy census, I don't know if you've heard of that, it's a census that was,
On your podcast, I heard mention, but I don't really know about it enough. Yeah, I don't really understand.
yeah, it was compiled by Dr. Simon Young. Um, and there's two. There's 2014 to 17, 2017 to 2023. And one of the questions is, and there's no right or wrong answer,
Mhm.
is what do you think fairies are?
Ah, yeah. So I think I have a lot of thoughts and I have no one opinion. Um, it crossed my mind with the Orpheus story um because she gets to speak so little because of what the husband says to her. Um, it made me wonder, is this another story about, I mean, is it her desires that are creating this being from elsewhere? I
Mhm.
mean, they're forbidden desires, and that those can sometimes come back to us in a scary form. Um, there's also interesting aspects of time, right? In that same story, I mean, there's an explicit reference through the names to the distant and past of antiquity. Um, but there does seem to be this um, this sense that I guess what I'm trying to pinpoint, what I think is
Mm,
fascinating in these stories, and is an open question, but one that is really an important one, is this sort of interaction, like the grafted tree. There's like sometimes it seems to matter the disposition of the person who gets to see the fairy, right?
mm,
Sometimes there's a certain kind of sensitivity or something that is making them either vulnerable or open, depending on it. So there is some aspect often of the person who is experiencing the fairy. Well, for example, when the king Orfeo finds the fairies, it's only after he's had years of privation and starvation and walking and wandering in the wilderness and actually letting go of everything he thinks he has and knows, right? So
mm,
so it's not simply something from the outside, but the outside, the other, the unknown is crucial to what makes this this being, this,
mm,
you know,
mhm,
um is a crucial part of it. It's even argued that in the earliest Lancelot story, his mother is the Lady of the Lake. This is different in
mhm,
some other versions. Um but um but one scholar said, it's because this Chrétien de Troyes, who's writing this story, he wants someone who's sort of pure, clean of courtly connections. He has no
mm,
ancestral responsibility. He actually isn't sort of from his inception because he's comes from fairyland. He doesn't owe anyone anything. So when he gives his love to Guinevere, it can be entire in a sense, right? I mean, that's that one early version of the story. This
mhm,
later is completely changed and inflected. But that's how other um a fairy could sort of has a connection with, right? And
mm,
also in other stories, you'll have one version of the story where the fairy is a fairy with supernatural powers and capabilities. Another version is almost exactly the same story, sometimes with the same names, but it is a Saracen or someone from Turkey or someone from a
mhm.
different culture or a faraway place or the distant past. So
Yeah.
I think time
Mm,
and mystery and um, and human agency and openness are all crucial elements to the experience,
yes.
but how exactly they play out will I don't know, they may be as varied as the experience. I don't know.
Yeah, that's a great answer. I love
Yeah.
that. I was just thinking, yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. Um, I just wanted to, as we sort of wrap up our chat, ask you about any places in nature that
Ah,
have inspired you or helped you to feel closer to that otherness that
yeah,
you connect
yeah,
with through the
yeah,
medieval stories.
yeah.
Yeah.
There's a kind of place. There's a place actually, walking distance from uh is that where is it? It's on Dartmoor. It's a bus stop because we used to take the bus there. And it's a pub. Oh, it's escaping my mind. You can walk down the hill through sheep pastures, and eventually you go through these places where you can pick blueberries at certain times of year. But there's this certain place where it is wild. My children actually saw a black adder there in the heather. Yeah, I said it couldn't be. They're very rare. No,
Mm,
I looked up their description. Definitely was. So yeah, play a wilderness. You have these tours around with sort of whipping wind. They also have a prehistoric feeling about them. But the place that I love, that we always would take our shoes off and dip our feet into, it was in this wild, sort of rough, inhospitable place. There's this place with this crystal clear stream trickling through, and sort of clear, bright green moss, bright green grass. And it seems like almost, um, I don't know, it just seems like its own little world.
yeah.
We always I mean, we always fantasize like, oh, we could live here. We could live off blueberries. We could stay here. Um,
I love that. Yes, there's so many places like that on Dartmoor, aren't there?
yeah,
And
yeah,
um, I've seen places like that in Wales as well, that
yeah.
where it's, they're a long way from pollution that we create,
Oh,
and the
yes,
air's really fresh and everything's
yes,
really bright. And
yeah,
like you were saying about these figures and places in these fairy stories, they seem more real, more vibrant
yes,
than
yes,
the world that we live in from day to day.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. Because custom makes us, or habit, um, yeah, and just the daily grind. It can make us less open to things that are to beautiful and fresh and powerful things that are there, but it can also just separate us from that whole unpolluted, or or from the world that is actually puts us in perspective because it's independent of us. Yeah.
Mm. Oh, that's a lovely note to finish on. Thank you, Naomi, for sharing
Th-
your wonderful knowledge
oh, thank you so much,
and
Claire.
for your
Yeah,
time. Yeah,
anytime. And yeah, I really look forward to seeing and listening to you again. So, yeah.
thank you.